Hello, my name is Roger van Gompel, and I'm going to talk about experiments that investigated task effects on the lexical boost in structural priming. And this is work in collaboration with Laura Wakeford and Leila Cantela. A well-known finding is that speakers tend to repeat sentence structures across utterances, and this finding is referred to as structural priming. And it occurs during normal conversation and in written texts, but it can also be elicited experimentally. And often structural priming has been studied using ditransitive structures, prepositional object or PO structures, and double object DO structures. So in a priming experiment, participants first produce a prime sentence either in the PO structure or the DO structure, and then they have to produce a target. So an example of a PO prime would be the farmer gave the potatoes to the buyer. An example of a DO prime would be the farmer gave the buyer the potatoes. And these two sentences are very similar in meaning, but different in structure. And then after producing one of these two primes, a participant needs to produce a target. For example, complete a sentence fragment the seller showed, which can be completed with either a PO or a DO structure. And the general finding is that participants produce more PO target completions and fewer DO target completions after PO than DO primes. They are being primed. And this structural priming method has been very useful for investigating how language users represent syntax. Now, an important finding is that structural priming is stronger when the verb is repeated between the prime and the target than when it isn't. And this finding is referred to as the lexical boost effect. And it was first observed by Pickering and Brannigan. They investigated ditransitive PO and DO structures in a structural priming experiment. And an example is here, where we see that the primes and the target have the same verb. And they found more priming when the verb was repeated in the target than when it wasn't. And this suggests that structural information is represented with the verb, which is the syntactic head of the PO and the DO structure. It determines whether this structure is possible. It subcategorizes for this structure. And in the residual activation model by Pickering and Brannigan, the lexical boost is due to residual activation of the link between the verb and the structure, the PO or the DO. And according to this model, the lexical boost should only occur with a repetition of the head, but not with a repetition of other words that are not heads of the PO or the DO structure. But there are alternative accounts of the lexical boost that predict that it should occur with a repetition of any content word. So for example, the model by Chang et al. Claims that repeated words act as a short-term memory cue for the structure of the prime, regardless of whether this word is the head of a structure or not. And the ACT-R model by Reiter and colleagues claims that lexical boost is due to associative learning, during which structures become associated with word meanings, any word meanings, not just the verb or the syntactic head. In a recent paper, Shapers and colleagues investigated whether the lexical boost occurs with non-head words using what I'll call the random word array task. In this task, participants first had to read a prime sentence aloud, either a PO or a DO prime sentence, and then they had to construct a target sentence from randomly ordered words, like these here. And they had to start with the word in red, so they might produce the evangelist sold the Bible to the youngster. And Shapers and colleagues found more priming when one of the nouns was repeated, for example, youngster, than when none of the nouns was repeated. We have also investigated the lexical boost using a variety of different methods, including the random word array task. And in 5 experiments, we showed no evidence for a lexical boost with a non-head noun, although we did find a lexical boost with a repetition of the verb. Now, the difference between the Shabers et al. Results and our results may be due to subtle differences in the method. It would take me too much time to explain exactly what they are. But the critical thing here is that it seems like the noun boost effect is not quite as robust as the verb boost effect, which has been observed using a variety of different methods in many different experiments. So that suggests that the head and the non-head boost may be due to different mechanisms. And the goal of the current experiment was to investigate this. To test this, we used 2 sentence completion tasks. In the look-back task, participants could see the prime and the target at the same time. So any word repetition was highly explicit. But in the no-look-back task, the prime and the target were presented one after the other. So when participants completed the target, they could not look back at the prime. Now, if the lexical boost is due to explicit memory for the prime, then it should be stronger when participants can look back at the prime, because they don't need to rely on their memory to realize that a word is repeated. It is visually still present. But if the head boost with verbs is more robust than the non-head boost with nouns, then the noun boost may be more affected by the task. So we conducted 4 structural priming experiments in which we manipulated either the repetition of the subject noun or the verb. And as I said, we also had 2 different tasks, the look back or the no look back task. So in the first 2 experiments, we manipulated repetition of the subject noun in ditransitive PO-DO structures. And in experiments 3 and 4, we manipulated verb repetition. And then for both, we had either a look back or no look back task. In experiment 1, we manipulated subject noun repetition and we used the look back task. So participants received a paper booklet and it contained sentence fragments, and participants had to provide a written completion to them. And the prime and targets were written underneath each other so they could see them at the same time. We also had a number of fillers to hide the priming manipulation. And we had 4 different prime conditions. So in the PO prime conditions, we gave participants the first noun phrase following the verb, so that most of the time participants produced a prepositional object completion. Whereas in the DO prime conditions, we gave them a noun phrase that usually elicited a double object structure. And participants completed one of these prime fragments, and then they had to complete a target fragment, and they could complete it using either a PO or a DO structure. And I should say we excluded any responses where participants didn't produce a PO or a DO completion in the primes. And what you can see here is that in the first 2 conditions, the subject noun phrase is repeated between prime and target, and in the next 2 conditions, it isn't. Here we have the results. I've plotted the percentage of PO target completions out of all PO and DO target completions. Any other responses were excluded from the analyses. And on the left here, we see the results when the noun was repeated, on the right, when it wasn't repeated. And we see that when the noun was repeated, participants produce more PO target completions after a PO prime than after a DO prime. So that is a structural priming effect here. But there was no such structural priming effect when the noun was not repeated. And this resulted in a significant interaction between prime structure and noun repetition. So we got a subject noun boost effect here. But as I just said, we found no evidence for abstract structural priming. That is, no evidence for priming when the noun was not repeated. And perhaps this is because participants realized that the first content word in the sentence was often repeated, and they may have started checking this. And in trials where the first word was not repeated, the additional processes involved in checking whether a word was repeated may actually have interfered with the structural priming. In experiment 2, again, we manipulated subject-noun repetition, but now we use the no look-back task. Participants saw sentence fragments on a computer screen, one after another, and then they typed completions. So when they saw the target, they could not look back at the prime. And the conditions are exactly the same as before. Here we have the results plotted in the same way as before, and we see a main effect of structural priming, but now there is no interaction with noun repetition. And the structural priming effect is significant both when the noun was repeated, but also when it was not repeated. So we got a structural priming effect, but no subject noun boost effect, indicating that the noun boost effect in experiment 1 was task specific, that only occurred when participants could see the prime when they completed the target. In experiment 3, we manipulated verb repetition and we used the look back task. And here we have an example of the conditions. So as you can see, we either have a PO or a DO eliciting a prime fragment, and again a target following it. And what you see in the first 2 conditions, the verb is repeated, and in the next 2 conditions, it isn't. And we got the following results. We got structural priming, both when the verb was repeated, but also when it wasn't repeated. However, the priming effect was stronger when the verb was repeated. So there is a verb boost effect here. The abstract structural priming in the absence of verb repetition contrasts with experiment 1, where priming only occurred when the noun was repeated. And one possible reason for this is that participants may not have checked for verb repetition because it is less obvious than subject repetition. The subject is the first content word in the sentence, whereas the verb is more in the middle. And therefore, there were no checking processes that interfered with the structural priming when the verb wasn't repeated. In experiment 4, we again manipulated verb repetition, but now we use the no look back task. So participants couldn't see the prime and the target simultaneously. And the conditions are exactly the same as before, the materials as well. The results are very similar to what we got in the previous experiment. So we get a main effect of structural priming, but again, the critical thing is that we got an interaction with verb repetition. So the structural priming was stronger when the verb was repeated than when it wasn't. So we got a verb boost effect even though participants couldn't see the prime and the target simultaneously. And this contrasts with the noun boost effect that we investigated in experiment 2, which wasn't observed with this task. The noun boost effect was only observed in experiment 1 when participants could look back. So the main finding from our experiments is that the verb boost effect occurs regardless of task, but the subject noun boost only occurs if participants can see the prime when they complete the target. So the subject noun boost appears to be more strategic than the verb boost effect is. Abstract structural priming, that is priming when there is no word repetition, is also strategic. It occurs in experiment 3, but not in experiment 1. And that suggests that checking for subject noun repetition interferes with abstract priming, as I mentioned before, whereas participants don't engage in such checking processes when verb repetition is manipulated. The finding that the noun boost occurs only if the repetition is explicit fits with Chang et al.'s account that the lexical boost is due to explicit memory. When noun repetition is visually explicit, participants don't need their explicit memory to reactivate the prime. Instead, they can just look back at the prime and reactivate the prime structure. But this account doesn't explain why the verb boost is unaffected by the task. And similarly, Roger et al.'s ACT-R model doesn't explain why the noun boost and the verb boost appear to be different. The results fit better with the residual activation model by Pickering and Brannigan. According to this model, the PO or the DO structure is automatically associated with its head, the verb. In contrast, it isn't automatically associated with any of the nouns in the sentence. So the noun boost is presumably due to more strategic processes that occur when participants can look back to check for word repetition. And this results in reactivation of the prime structure when the noun is repeated, but as we have seen, interference with priming when the noun is not repeated. Our experiments also have methodological implications. Structural priming studies have used quite a wide variety of different tasks, but our findings show that the findings can critically depend on the task. So I think it's important that future research tries to establish to what extent these different methods tap into the same or in different syntactic representations. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.